truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Thursday, September 26th, 2024, the 1,345th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you'll get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so let's get started with one of the big headlines of the day. Not the biggest headline of the day. The biggest headline of the day is a hurricane that might hit Florida. It's down in the Gulf right now. It appeared out of nowhere just a couple of days ago and then looked like it was going to dissipate, but now it might be the biggest hurricane ever. CNN's front page right now is calling it one of the largest storms of the last century. And so, to the extent that they actually brew one up, I hope everybody down in the Gulf stays as safe as possible. And of course, I wish you all the best. I'm hopeful that maybe Donald Trump still has control of his Sharpie and spins that storm offshore, but that we still get some quality video of Ron DeSantis walking around in his wading boots again. But the other major headline of the day is the indictment of the illegitimate mayor of New York, who was installed a couple years ago, Eric Adams. The headline in CNN: NYC Mayor Eric Adams indicted on 5 federal public corruption charges, including bribery and wire fraud. New York City Mayor Eric Adams has been indicted on 5 federal charges related to bribery, wire fraud, conspiracy, and soliciting campaign contributions from foreign nationals, according to a 57-page indictment unsealed Thursday morning. The indictment alleges actions stretching back to 2014, from when he was Brooklyn Borough President. For nearly a decade, Adams sought and accepted improper valuable benefits, such as luxury international travel, including from wealthy foreign business people, and at least one Turkish government official seeking to gain influence over him, the indictment reads. Specifically, Adams received luxury travel and other benefits from a Turkish official, and later, in exchange, pressured the New York City Fire Department to open a Turkish consular building without a fire inspection, the indictment says. The mayor, quote, engaged in a long-running conspiracy, end quote, says Damian Williams, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Mayor Adams took these contributions even though he knew they were illegal, Williams said. He knew these contributions were attempts by a Turkish government official and Turkish businessman to buy influence with him. Adams said Thursday morning he was not surprised by the charges and encouraged the public to, quote, wait to hear our defense before making any judgments, end quote, adding he would not be changing his day-to-day responsibilities in light of the indictment. I look forward to defending myself and defending the people of this city as I've done throughout my entire professional career, Adams said. The indictment represents a dramatic fall from grace for the mayor of America's largest city and a stunning accusation against one of the nation's most high-profile offices a year ahead of the next mayoral election. Adams, a former NYPD captain, took office in January 2022 and presented himself as the new face of the Democrat Party, promising a tough-on-crime approach and commitment to revitalizing the city after the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet he has struggled to resolve the city's key challenges, such as the migrant crisis and concerns about subway safety, and has faced criticism for his late-night partying and clashes over city spending, particularly on education. He once described himself as the Biden of Brooklyn, but he has increasingly criticized the Biden administration and the federal government over its handling of immigration issues. Now, if all of these corruption and bribery charges turn out to be true, it sounds like he probably is the Biden of Brooklyn. But there's plenty of reasons to be suspect about what's going on here. First, these charges apparently stem from conduct that began a year ago. Now, maybe that's real, and maybe they've been tracking him this whole time and decided that now was the right time when they could finally prove their case, but that seems awfully unlikely. Are we to believe that no one in the Democrat power structure knew about his former criminality prior to installing him in that office? Are we supposed to pretend that New York City has legitimate elections? New York City has terrible elections. New York City passed a law a couple years ago making it legal for non-citizens to participate in their elections, and that was struck down by the courts and ruled unconstitutional ultimately. But New York City has awful elections. The public-facing side of Eric Adams' tenure seems like a ridiculous farce, as most of our public-facing politics and politicians do. We're to believe that his crime is taking money from foreign officials and foreign governments, that there's something particular about Turkey that we should be concerned about in this situation. But as always, the only concern is the good twin, evil twin dynamic. It's highly improbable that he was getting money from sovereign Turkey first Turkish nationalists And when you remove that possibility, the only other possibility is that he was getting money from elements of the global regime in Turkey, which means little more than he was participating in the same payment scam that the rest of the uniparty participates in. Now, the Southern District of New York is thought by a lot of people to be where the real work is getting done legally in this country. The Southern District is where it goes down. Rudy Giuliani served as a U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, and it was during his tenure that he went after white-collar crime and the mafia under the RICO Act that we discussed yesterday. Rudy, of course, was also the former mayor of New York during 9/11. And certainly not coincidentally, Rudy Giuliani was just disbarred today from the District Court of Washington, D.C., which is not like the other district courts. It has its own special relationship with the federal government by virtue of its being in Washington, D.C., a foreign-occupied federal district that should be done away with, as should the court, so it is then subsumed back into Maryland and or Virginia. I asked Perplexity AI about the special relationship. The D.C. District Court has jurisdiction over cases involving federal agencies. Many cases with political implications are heard by this court, including those related to the Pentagon Papers, the Watergate scandal, and the Iran-Contra affair. So if you ever need to be sure that court cases are decided on behalf of the global regime, well, why not put them in the global regime's non-American federal district? Many of the founding fathers were against this concept entirely, but good old Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists got it pushed right through because the global regime needed its own place right in this quote-unquote independent United States of America. The court is considered one of the most important venues in the country due to several factors: its location in the nation's capital, its authority over federal agencies, and the effect it's had over shaping policy and enforcing the separation of powers. And there are some differences with how judges get nominated and placed on the Washington, D.C. District Court bench. To be qualified, they have to be members of the D.C. Bar, and they have to have lived in Washington, D.C. for at least 5 years. So I guess they need to be fully approved and embedded in the D.C. swamp. They have their own nominating commission that sends its recommendations to the president. Their nominating process is overseen by the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, rather than the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they serve only for 15 years rather than getting lifetime appointments. So isn't that great that the district court that handles all the major scandalous political issues and shapes policy and does all that is itself part of the swamp by rule? They made it that way on purpose. Oh, it's so great. I could say I feel bad about Rudy having to be publicly shamed like this in such a silly way and dishonored, but I would guess he doesn't care at all. This court shouldn't exist, at least not in its current form, and neither should Washington, D.C., to be honest. And I mean as the seat of the federal government and as a non-American federal district of the global regime within our country. I'm not suggesting the place be blown up or anything. And isn't that amazing? It's totally rational to want some gross creation of the global regime to be eliminated for purely principled political reasons without wanting any violence against anyone at all. I know it's impossible to apply that principle anywhere else, especially not Israel. I just think it's nice that we can have rational conversations about it when we're talking about Washington, D.C., that, of course, was formed by and on behalf of essentially the same people. And am I saying the Jews established Washington, D.C.? No, but they didn't establish Israel either. It's just the regime, the same regime, all over the place. But let's get back to Eric Adams. We were talking about the Southern District of New York. Attorney Damian Williams hosted a press conference this morning detailing the charges in the indictment. Damian Williams is also the same man who prosecuted Ghislaine Maxwell and is now going after Sean Diddy Combs. Now, leaving aside, again, any guilt from these three people, and I have no sympathy for Eric Adams, Ghislaine Maxwell, or Sean Combs whatsoever, particularly the last two, because there's strong reason to believe they were both involved in some pretty heinous stuff. But all three of these cases are massive, high-profile cases. We should assume that on some level these are ops. We're told that this prosecution is coming now, and that it was initiated by the illegitimate Joe Biden regime in response to Mayor Eric Adams getting tough on illegal immigration. Did Eric Adams get tough on illegal immigration? Of course not. That's an absurdity. He did little more than admit there was a problem and lower the shelter limits and cut some budgets. He's not some anti-immigration warrior, though he's being portrayed that way, and you gotta wonder why. Eric Adams doesn't even clear the bare minimum when it comes to illegal immigration. He's just less bad relative to the absolute worst people. So he's certainly not being prosecuted as backlash for that. Williams was also involved in the Sam Bankman-Fried and Robert Menendez prosecutions. And you might say, yeah, well, the Southern District of New York is a very important prosecutor's office. They oversee New York. This is where our finance happens. Of course, there are going to be a lot of important cases flowing through there. And yeah, that's certainly true. And of course, we're not paying attention to the smaller cases, but that's quite a handful. CNN adds, nearly 3 years into his first term, Adams' political career is in jeopardy, and several prominent New York political figures, including Democrat U.S. Representative AOC, have already called for his resignation. If he were to resign, the job of America's most high-profile mayor would go to the city's public advocate, Jumaine Williams, until a special election. So they would be able to get Adams out of there and replace him with someone else right away. New York Governor Kathy Hochul has the power to remove the mayor, but sources say she is not considering it at this point. Adams could also be removed through an inability committee, according to the city charter. The committee would include the city's top lawyer, a post that is currently vacant. City Comptroller Brad Lander, who is also currently running against Adams, would also have a spot on the committee, along with the Speaker of the City Council, one deputy mayor selected by the mayor, and the borough president, who has served the most consecutive years in office. Adams had himself an outdoor press conference this morning. It turned into a bit of a clown show. There were hecklers about, and Mayor Adams' entire public persona seems like a facade in the first place, so these are the sorts of things you might expect. We also have to deal with the unfortunate circumstance that a new word is being used in all the media coverage of this. It's his honor. Like his honor. That's what you're supposed to call the mayor, apparently. I look forward to when America actually eliminates these titles of nobility. But it's being stylized in print Hizzoner, his honor. And apparently we're all supposed to just immediately adopt the new term. Oh, I know what the secret code word means. And to be clear, I am not suggesting this is new at all. The word's been around for a while. It's just annoying to see such a silly term immediately adopted and so quickly become so widespread. They routinely use changes in our language against us and attempt to make us speak in their terms and think in their terms. The last thing you want to do is increase your vocabulary with some ridiculous and useless word like this. Now, we're going to have to see what's actually going on here, but we can basically assume that the surface interpretation that we are being fed is false. It doesn't make sense on its face. No one's going after Eric Adams for how he's talked about the issue of illegal immigration in New York. The charges stem from conduct a while back, and maybe it's been ongoing, but the likelihood of that all just having been discovered and then prosecuted in any natural way is very low. We've also watched fake indictment after fake lawsuit after fake trial after fake conviction when it comes to Donald Trump. So at the very least, we should take a few steps back from this and not assume anything about who did what. The critical thing to know is what the direct motivation for this obvious takedown and for its timing actually is. It's entirely possible that the Uniparty wants something done that Eric Adams isn't going to do, and they're trying to remove him and replace him with someone else, a known quantity. But that seems rather unlikely. Eric Adams is a corrupt politician, but only to a point. He's not going to go along with the program anymore. It sounds silly. Adams came out and made a statement last night, and he said in that statement that they busted into the residence of the newly appointed New York City Police Commissioner Tom Donlin, seeking documents from 20 years ago. So something else is clearly going on here. And at that point, from my perspective, I start thinking this seems like another template for various elements of disclosure about what the regime has already done, and perhaps what people like Eric Adams, and particularly Eric Adams, have already done. So we'll see how this plays out. Let's go to Just the News, and this is from Monday. I just want to hit this quickly because this is in full a rerun. Bombshell transcripts. Trump urged use of troops to protect Capitol on January 6th, but was rebuffed. This is something we've known for coming up on 4 years. Then President Donald Trump gave clear instructions to Pentagon brass days before the January 6th riots to, quote, do whatever it takes, end quote, to keep the U.S. Capitol safe, including deploying National Guard or active duty troops. But top officials did not comply because of political concerns, according to transcripts of bombshell interviews conducted by the Defense Department's chief watchdog that shine new light on government dysfunction ahead of the historic tragedy. Well, John Solomon is a wonderful reporter. Historic tragedy is a little overdramatic. And again, we've known about this for quite a long time. General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, confirmed to the Pentagon Inspector General 3 years ago that during a January 3rd, 2021 Oval Office meeting, Trump pre-approved the use of National Guard or active duty troops to keep peace in the nation's capital on the day Congress was to certify the results of the 2020 election. Milley's interviews were among several key to transcripts obtained by House Administration Oversight Subcommittee Chairman Barry Loudermilk of Georgia and shared with Just the News. The president just says, hey, look at this. It's going to be a large amount of protesters coming here on the 6th, and make sure that you have sufficient National Guard or soldiers to make sure it's a safe event. Milley told the Inspector General in one of 2 interviews he did in spring 2021 during a probe of the Pentagon's response to January 6th. Milley said then acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller, himself a former general, assured Trump there was an adequate safety plan for Pentagon assistance to Washington, D.C. Miller responds by saying, hey, we've got a plan and we've got it covered, and that's about it, Milley recalled. Milley confirmed a second time during the interviews that Trump was clear in his wishes. It was just what I just described, which was, hey, I don't care if you use guard or soldiers, active duty soldiers, do whatever you have to do, just make sure it's safe, the general told the Inspector General. But other transcripts gathered by Loudermilk during his subcommittee's ongoing probe of January 6th security failures show civilian leadership at the Pentagon admitting openly they would not comply with Trump's wishes, with some saying they did not like the optics of armed soldiers or guardsmen roaming the Capitol with weapons during what was supposed to be a peaceful transition of power. There is absolutely no way I was putting U.S. military forces at the Capitol, period, Miller told the Inspector General during his March 2021 interview. Miller said officials instead used an interagency process to devise an alternative plan that would put some D.C. National Guard troops on the ground in the nation's capital to direct traffic, but not to guard the Capitol, a plan that D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser suggested. The article goes on. I would encourage you to check that out if you are not as familiar with this story. Donald Trump responded this morning on Truth Social. He said, shocking breaking news, as exposed by the great John Solomon, a real journalist who cares about the truth and the great work of Congressman Barry Loudermilk and the Republicans on the House Oversight Committee. The deep state chose to disregard my direct authorization of at least 10,000 National Guard troops to ensure that Washington, D.C. was safe and secure on January 6, 2021. These deep state subversives disobeyed the president's directives, which would have prevented any unrest that day. January 6th, as it is known, would have never taken place. These revelations end the sham J6 civil hoaxes and the lawless D.C. case brought by deranged Jack Smith, which has already been demolished by the United States Supreme Court's historic immunity and Fisher decisions. I called for everyone to act peacefully and patriotically and demanded that D.C. be protected. The deep state and crazy Nancy Pelosi, who admitted to her daughter on videotape that she was, quote unquote, responsible, have to be held to account, including for the damages, wasted resources, and time spent defending the witch hunts and hoaxes. We have to save our broken justice system. And Trump is right, of course. All of the indictments and charges against him are part of this same stage show, this farce, hopefully this template for discovery by the American people that the justice system is indeed rigged and can be used against political dissidents in this country. And political dissidents in this country includes everyone from individual activists on the ground in their local community who do not want the global regime's agenda enforced across the entire country, all the way up to the president of the United States of America, who does not want to enforce that global agenda in the United States. They will go after anyone at any level. And we have another great example today with Rudy Giuliani being, quote unquote, disbarred. We should get rid of the bar, too, while we're at it. It's not only that there is a two-tiered system of justice that is used to protect certain people and to attack others. It's that justice system exists for the use of that one side. They are able to wield that corrupt system against the American people because the American people are cowed and conditioned to grovel before the abstract power hierarchy that supports that system. Trump, and by association his supporters, have been pursued, prosecuted, and persecuted by that system for the last nearly 4 years, all on false pretenses that were clearly false at the time if you were paying attention in an open-minded way. But if you weren't, that's what this whole TV show that seemingly never ends is for. But the key is you have to remember to apply the principles correctly, no matter who they're meant to be applied to. And we should stay open to all potentially plausible possibilities. Any potentiality that could emerge into our reality is something we should stay open to, including that Eric Adams did all the things he's accused of, was wrapped up years ago, and then was simply installed as mayor of New York in order to provide this template. I think ultimately we'll see a lot of examples of that. All right, so I want to play a clip from Trump's speech on Saturday afternoon. We discussed it a little bit on the Devolution Power Hour on Saturday night, and I've mentioned it a couple of times over these past few days. As we know, Trump's been laying out his economic policies. He keeps going a little bit further on taxes every few weeks. We are now at the point where Trump has promised to eliminate federal income taxes on Social Security, on tips, and on overtime. And then we know that last Monday, he did a Twitter Spaces to announce the launch of World Liberty Financial, which is a decentralized finance startup in the cryptocurrency space. Now, decentralized finance would be the sort of thing that would totally disrupt banking as we know it. They're all about centralized finance. They want everyone in the world using the regime bankers' fiat currency, currently branded as the American dollar. Leaders have been assassinated. Countries have been overthrown to keep those countries on the regime's fiat currency. And there's a very strong argument to be made that that was one of the major causes of World War II. Now, the problem with the fiat bankers and their grip on control over the entire world is that it seemed so all-encompassing that a parallel competing system could never be built, and we could never actually extricate ourselves from that situation, especially not the United States, because it's our dollar, isn't it? And of course, the answer is, well, no. We rent those dollars via the Federal Reserve, and we pay rental fees in the form of taxes for the privilege. And they can change the value of our money anytime they want. And of course, money is the number one incentive for pretty much anyone on anything. So if you have full control over that resource and it is unlimited by nature because you're the one who creates it, you can basically control the entire world just through the currency. And of course, most people are familiar with the quote attributed to Mayor Amsel Rothschild, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." Now, we're told that that quote is an anti-Semitic conspiracy that could never be attributed to someone like Mayor Amsel Rothschild. Just this past April, there was a controversy in the UK because brief and former Prime Minister Liz Truss, who was apparently among the last people to see Queen Elizabeth alive, wrote that quote in her book, attributing it to Mayor Amsel Rothschild. It's actually silly to even dispute the authenticity of the quote because you can see through their actions over hundreds of years that that is the strategy they've pursued. And of course, it is all-encompassing. A lot of things would have to change to get us fully away from that situation. There are many elements of that control system that need to be broken down. First, we would need a new currency. Well, thank goodness one or more of those is on the way. If we're not renting their currency, then we don't need the federal income tax we pay now, and we don't need the IRS. And so it makes sense that Trump is getting rid of the income taxes and the IRS is endorsing Kamala Harris. And then, of course, unless you want all the economic activity to stop, there needs to be some means of finance so that people are able to innovate and take risks. And so parallel systems are blossoming across those areas. But let's listen to what Trump said on Saturday, because this is another major blow.
While working Americans catch up, we're going to put a temporary cap on interest rates on credit card debt at 10%. Some people are paying 25 and 30%. It's crazy. You know, in theory, that's against the law. Okay, called the usury laws. But in theory, that's against, so we're going to cap it for a period of time at 10%.
Now, I don't know about you, but I've had credit card debt at various points in my life, including substantial credit card debt at various points. My job was completely eliminated the moment the very deadly pandemic started. My 15-year career was gone in the snap of Gavin Newsom's fingers, and I racked up some serious debt over the following year or so. Credit card rates over the last few years have skyrocketed into the high 20s and sometimes over 30% APR. And at those rates, it's basically impossible to ever pay off credit card debt. Half or more of the monthly payment just goes to paying back the last month's interest charge. And so capping interest rates at 10% would be an incredible relief for Americans struggling financially and dealing with credit card debt that seems like it's never going to be paid off. And of course, I'm all for that. But I was more interested in Trump's comments on usury. And he said, theoretically, it should be against the law. Theoretically, this should be illegal. And that's true. But it's not only that it should be illegal, it's that usury is immoral. And it was forbidden not only in scripture and religious practices, but it was forbidden by European nobles and culture in general. And so let's go through the history of usury just a little bit. We'll start with Wikipedia. Usury is the practice of making loans that are seen as unfairly enriching the lender. The term may be used in a moral sense, condemning taking advantage of others' misfortunes, or in a legal sense where an interest rate is charged in excess of the maximum rate that is allowed by law. A loan may be considered usurious because of the excessive or abusive interest rates or other factors defined by the laws of a state. Someone who practices usury can be called a usurer, but in modern colloquial English may be called a loan shark. And for whatever reason, we don't think of it that way when it's the credit card company. When it's the bank, we think, oh, this is just the formal organization, and this is how much this money costs now. But if they're performing the same function as the loan sharks and they get to write the laws through our representatives in that foreign-occupied federal district, Washington, D.C., then in many ways they're far worse than loan sharks. In many historical societies, including ancient Christian, Jewish, and Islamic societies, usury meant the charging of interest of any kind and was considered wrong or was made illegal. The Wikipedia entry goes through various religious perspectives on usury. Just one note from the section on the Jewish perspective, and hopefully we've talked about this subject enough times. Talking about the real-world effects of religious practices and religious beliefs cannot be off limits. For whatever reason, we still have to caveat things like not all Christians are this way, or not all Jews are this way, or not all Muslims are this way. Because of course they're not, and we're not brain-dead communists. And even aside from that, we have to understand that there are a lot of people who self-identify as practitioners of a certain faith and do not actually correspond to the belief system nor follow its guidance at all. In fact, there are people who have historically adopted the faith of others as a cloak and as a protection, and historically that's happened quite a lot with the Jewish faith. But let's get into it. As Jewish people were ostracized from most professions by local rulers during the Middle Ages, the Western churches, and the guilds, they were pushed into marginal occupations considered socially inferior, such as tax and rent collecting and money lending. Yeah, you see, they were being victimized and kicked out of other cultures, which is why they had to turn to tax and rent collecting and money lending. They were forced into these jobs by people's anti-Semitism. It's not that they wanted to rip people off in ways that they weren't able to rip themselves off because of cultural and religious restrictions that weren't imposed on these Jewish people. It was that they were oppressed into becoming bankers. Natural tensions between creditors and debtors were added to social, political, religious, and economic strains. Financial oppression of Jews tended to occur in areas where they were most disliked. And if Jews reacted by concentrating on money lending to non-Jews, the unpopularity, and so, of course, the pressure, would increase. Thus, the Jews became an element in a vicious circle. The Christians, on the basis of biblical rulings, condemned interest-taking absolutely. And from 1179, those who practiced it were excommunicated. Catholic autocrats frequently imposed the harshest financial burdens on the Jews. The Jews reacted by engaging in the one business where Christian laws actually discriminated in their favor and became identified with the hated trade of money lending. I can't believe they were forced to go through becoming our bankers. Several historic rulings in Jewish law have mitigated the allowance for usury toward non-Jews. For instance, the 15th century commentator Rabbi Isaac Abarbanel specified that the rubric for allowing interest does not apply to Christians or Muslims because their faith systems have a common ethical basis originating from Judaism. The medieval commentator Rabbi David Kimmy extended this principle to non-Jews who show consideration for Jews, saying they should be treated with the same consideration when they borrow. So that's more like ethical usury, I guess we could call it. And I want to skip over to another Wikipedia entry before we return to that one. This one for the term court Jew. In early modern Europe, particularly in Germany, a court Jew, or quote-unquote court factor, was a Jewish banker who handled the finances of or lent money to royalty and nobility. In return for their services, court Jews gained social privileges, including in some cases being granted noble status. Examples of what would later be called court Jews emerged in the High Middle Ages, when the royalty, the nobility, and the church borrowed money from money changers or employed them as financiers. Among the most notable of these were Aaron of Lincoln and Vivelin of Strasbourg. Jewish financiers could use their family connections to provide their sponsors with finance, food, arms, ammunition, gold, and other precious metals. the rise of the absolute monarchies in Central Europe brought many Jews, mostly of Ashkenazi origin, into the position of negotiating loans for the various courts. They could amass personal fortunes and gain political and social influence. However, the court Jew had social connections and influence in the Christian world mainly through the Christian nobility and church. Due to the precarious position of Jews, some nobles could ignore their debts. If the sponsoring noble died, his Jewish financier could face exile or execution. Now that's pretty incredible, isn't it? It kind of illustrates a protective relationship of the nobility over the court factor or court Jew who runs all of the financing. And it also illustrates the reason for that protection, because what they were doing was looked at by society as evil. How have things changed since then? Well, now it's not a court factor or a court Jew. Now we have banks with very corporate names on them, like Citibank or Bank of America or Wells Fargo. They're just companies that give us money sometimes. Sometimes it's even our own money that they're giving us, and sometimes we give them our money to hold and protect, and they just go ahead and lose it. Whoops. The most famous example of this occurred in Württemberg in 1737 to 1738, when, after the death of his sponsor, Charles Alexander, Joseph Oppenheimer was put on trial and executed. Well, thank goodness those Oppenheimers recovered enough to make nuclear weapons, quote unquote, and a big piece of the world's diamonds trade. In an effort to avoid such a fate, some court bankers in the late 18th century, including Samuel Bleichroder, Mayer Amschel Rothschild, and Aaron Elias Seligman, successfully detached their businesses from these courts and established what eventually developed into full-fledged banks. Kudos to them, most especially Rothschild, who went from court factor all the way up to richest man in the world, who controls the whole world and basically founded Zionism and took over country after country after country in the person of the British Crown, embodied in the British Empire, by making use of the exact philosophy we discussed before. But of course, that quote couldn't been from him. It's been debunked. Just a bit more from this entry. At the dawn of mercantilism, while most Sephardi Jews were primarily active in the West in maritime and colonial trade, the Ashkenazi Jews in the service of the emperor and princes tended toward domestic trade. They were mostly wealthy businessmen, distinguished above their co-religionists by their commercial instincts and their adaptability. Court Jews frequently came into conflict with court rivals and co-religionists. The court Jews, as the agents of the rulers, and in times of war as the purveyors and the treasurers of the state, enjoyed special privileges. They were under the jurisdiction of the court martial and were not compelled to wear the Jew's badge. They were committed to stay wherever the emperor held his court and to live anywhere in the Holy Roman Empire, even in places where no other Jews were allowed. Wherever they settled, they could buy houses, slaughter meat according to the Jewish ritual, and maintain a rabbi. They could sell their goods, wholesale and retail, and could not be taxed or assessed higher than the Christians. Jews were sometimes assigned the role of local tax collectors. It's amazing the sort of life you can make for yourself when you control the money, and through that control all the most powerful people. Also noteworthy that they didn't care so much about their co-religionists, which is to say their fellow Jews. I've mentioned many times the book, The Transfer Agreement, by Edwin Black, himself a Jew and Zionist. It was published in 1984 and is now in its third edition. It's been a very popular book, a highly rewarded book, and the book is quite explicit about how the Zionists, who are tied into all of that quote-unquote international finance and international media, didn't care too much at all for their co-religionists, their fellow Jews, particularly German Jews. They needed all of them from Europe moved down to Palestine in order to settle the global regime proxy state, the Zionist home that currently carries the name of Israel. If you're interested in this topic, I would strongly suggest Going and checking out Prussiagate, you can find it at prussiagate.substack.com, particularly the sub-series titled Evolution of Slavery. I believe that the distinctions around the practice of usury need to be understood because within this is the explanation for why the problems aren't quote-unquote the Jews, but that the people at the roots of so many of these problems are ones who have assumed Jewish identity. And to be clear, there are people of all types serving their interests and their agenda. Let's go back to the entry on usury for a bit on how this works in the United States. Usury laws are state laws that specify the maximum legal interest rate at which loans can be made. In the United States, the primary legal power to regulate usury rests primarily with the states. Each U.S. state has its own statute that dictates how much interest can be charged before it is considered usurious or unlawful. If a lender charges above the lawful interest rate, a court will not allow the lender to sue to recover the unlawfully high interest. And some states will apply all payments made on the debt to the principal balance. In some states, such as New York, usurious loans are voided ab initio. And we should keep that in mind because I strongly suspect that Donald Trump's words are going to carry. We're going to get into the credit card usury in just a minute. But keep this in mind. If all the payments that have been made on interest charged at usurious rates are made to be applied to the principal of the debt, a whole lot of people are going to see their debt wiped away immediately. On federal regulations. On a federal level, Congress has never attempted to federally regulate interest rates on purely private transactions, but on the basis of past U.S. Supreme Court decisions, arguably the U.S. Congress might have the power to do so under the Interstate Commerce Clause of Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress imposed a federal criminal penalty for unlawful interest rates through the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO again, amazing. And its definition of unlawful debt, which makes it a potential federal felony to lend money at an interest rate more than twice the local state usury rate and then try to collect that debt. There are many states that set those rates at 7%, 8%, 10%, 12%. So an interest rate of 20, 25, 30% is double the maximum rate for non-usurious lending. Separate federal rules apply to most banks. Oh, that's so good. Thank goodness they have their own carve-outs. I wonder how they got them. The U.S. Supreme Court held unanimously in the 1978 case Marquette National Bank of Minneapolis v. First Omaha Service Corporation that the National Banking Act of 1863, the Civil War era, allowed nationally chartered banks to charge the legal rate of interest in their state regardless of the borrower's state of residence. In 1980, Congress passed the Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act. Among the Act's provisions, it exempted federally chartered savings banks, installment plan sellers, and chartered loan companies from state usury limits. Combined with the Marquette decision that applied to national banks, this effectively overrode all state and local usury laws. The 1968 Truth in Lending Act does not regulate rates except for some mortgages, but requires uniform or standardized disclosure of costs and charges. So think about the federal versus state issue here. One state jacks their rate up real high or doesn't have one at all, and then all of the states via the Marquette decision are overridden to conform to the highest interest rate. The federal government essentially gets to just violate the 10th Amendment and remove the role of the states completely. And I have a feeling that's what Donald Trump is talking about when he says that, in theory, this is all illegal. It seems like the banks might have a hard time in the future. Now, there are states with no usury limit whatsoever. Nevada has none. Delaware has none. Utah, Idaho, Wisconsin. But let's focus just on Delaware. Delaware is known as a haven for credit card companies and other lenders due to its lack of usury laws. Many major banks and credit card issuers have their credit card operations based in Delaware to take advantage of the state's lax Usury laws. This situation arose from the 1978 Marquette National Bank Supreme Court decision, which allowed banks to quote unquote export their home state's interest rates to other states. As a result, Delaware, along with South Dakota, eliminated its usury laws to attract credit card companies and other lenders. How about that? Delaware is basically a sanctuary state for usury. And who's the senator from Delaware who allowed all of this over his storied career of corruption? Well, that would be Joseph Robinette Biden. Biden's also the guy that made it impossible for people to discharge their college loan debt through claims of bankruptcy. Isn't that amazing that the fake president is one of the American politicians most responsible for the enormous debt held by the American people? He is literally a functionary by which the bankers were enabled to put virtually all of the American people into their debt. That is Joseph Robinette Biden. That is why he gets to be fake president. And I wonder if that's what he means when he calls himself a Christian Zionist. Now, I had Perplexity summarize for me the criticisms of that Marquette decision. I've found it's usually a good strategy with these AIs to ask them to summarize the criticisms or ask if there are any particular conspiracy theories, not so that I can assume their answer is correct, but because it often tells me other places to look. So let's go through some of these criticisms. Number one, nullification of state usury laws. The 1978 decision effectively nullified many state usury laws by holding that states cannot impose interest rate caps on national banks headquartered in other states. This allowed banks to export high interest rates across state lines. Number two, enabled punishing interest rates. The ruling opened the door to very high interest rates on bank credit cards, as banks could now base their operations in states with high or no usury caps. Thank goodness we can trust the Supreme Court that they were just properly assessing the law in relation to the original meaning of the Constitution and weren't also simply controlled by the banks and offering them the gift of all gifts that has systematically destroyed the country ever since. Number three, regulatory arbitrage. It incentivized large national banks to move or to incorporate in states with higher non-existent usury caps, leading to a race to the bottom in terms of consumer protections. Acceleration of subprime lending. The decision helped accelerate the credit card and subprime lending boom by removing interest rate restrictions. Disproportionate impact on the poor. Critics argue that this allowed predatory lending practices that disproportionately affect low-income borrowers who rely on credit cards and high-interest loans. And of course, the banks also determined the interest rate on an individual basis. Number six, despite having the power to amend national banking laws to reinstate state-level usury protections, Congress has not done so in over 40 years. Wow, shocking. The decision is seen as prioritizing the profitability of banks over protecting consumers from excessive interest rates. It represented a significant shift from historical and religious prohibitions on usury that had existed for centuries. The decision added complexity to lending markets, creating issues around loan, securitization, and secondary markets that are still being litigated today. It's viewed as an erosion of states' rights to protect their citizens through usury laws, centralizing more power with federal regulators and national banks. So yet another example of a big chunk of the regime's strategy, the agenda, the apparatus that can and must be removed completely. This is one of those things that has to happen. If my logic, my reasoning, my view on what's happening in general is sound, this is one of those things that must inevitably happen because it's not going to work in the future aside from it being immoral and illegal. And you might think, well, that's all pie in the sky. But is it? The media protectors of these banks certainly don't seem to think so. They're kind of in a panic. The editorial board of the Wall Street Journal on Sunday published this article, Trump's Price Controls on Credit Cards. Donald Trump keeps trying to micro-target working-class voters, but he's bidding himself into policy and political dead ends. While working Americans catch up, we're going to put a temporary cap on credit card interest rates. He told a rally last week in New York, we're going to cap it around 10%. We can't let them make 25 and 30%. And I played the quote for you. You heard it. He immediately went into a discussion of usury. But the Wall Street Journal has other ideas. That's a price control on credit. It would be comforting to write off this remark as another of Mr. Trump's rally improvisations, like references to Hannibal Lecter. But watch the video, and it looks as if Mr. Trump is reading the credit card policy off the teleprompter. Oh, so he really means it, you're saying. Mr. Trump's promised temporary, in quotes, 10% cap is lower than the rate that America's two leading socialists proposed in 2019. Well, that's okay. It doesn't make the policy socialist. He's just outlawing usury. A bill from Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez aimed to limit rates on consumer debt to 15%. Modern-day loan sharks are no longer lurking on street corners breaking kneecaps, Mr. Sanders said. They wear three-piece suits and work on Wall Street. And they also bought Bernie Sanders all of his houses and consider themselves to be Bernie Sanders co-religionists, though they are all ultimately atheists. Yet economics teaches there's no free lunch. Millions of Americans use credit cards as convenient and ubiquitous payment networks, and they don't owe interest because they pay off their balances at the end of each month. Debit cards are an alternative. People in a pinch also use credit cards to cover emergencies or financial shortfalls. And in the real world, that first example where people use them and pay them off at the end of each month rather than just using their debit card, that's a smaller percentage of the population, and they're usually just trying to rack up points and believe that somehow they're totally dominating the credit card companies. And now let's really get into it. The interest rates on credit cards reflect operating costs, including non-payment. A 10% cap would effectively cut off people with less than pristine credit scores. After Illinois capped many consumer interest rates at 36%, quote-unquote all-in APR, a study in the journal Public Choice said, quote, financial well-being declined, end quote, for residents who lost access to short-term, small-dollar loans. Oh, well, I guess that argument is conclusive. Let's just wrap it up and go home. But wait a second. They just said the interest rates on credit cards reflect operating costs, including non-payment. So my interest rate is reflective of other people failing to pay. That means that I am being forced by the bank to subsidize other people. And that, I think, is socialism. I thought that's what this article meant to condemn. It's almost like these people are just willing to say whatever they have to on behalf of these banks. Why do Trump and Sanders think it's helpful to limit credit access and send folks to the pawnbroker or the leg breaker instead? Card companies might respond by raising fees, which is what happened to free checking after Democrats regulated debit swipe charges in 2010. And of course, they are ignoring completely Trump's following statement about usury, because if the usury laws were restored, pawnbrokers and leg breakers would also be breaking the same laws. Of course, if you're going around breaking legs, you're already breaking the law. Who are the people protecting those sorts of criminal enterprises? Well, the same people running the grand criminal enterprise that supports the regime bankers. This is just false reality garbage in this awful editorial from the Wall Street Journal's editorial board. These are supposed to be the conservatives, aren't they? No, they just operate on behalf of global regime bankers, just like the rest of the regime. Mr. Trump has criticized Kamala Harris for proposing price controls on groceries. After causing catastrophic inflation, he told a Pennsylvania rally, Comrade Kamala announced that she wants to institute socialist price controls. You saw that? Never worked before. Never ever worked. He's right, yet Mr. Trump is doing the same on credit cards. It's bad enough to have a Democratic Party that ignores economics. What's the point of a Republican Party that follows suit? Hey, here's a question. Wall Street Journal editors, what's the point of pretending that you're a conservative paper when you're actually supporting the global communist machine? They ignored Trump's statements on usury completely. They didn't even get a mention in this article because the last thing the bankers want and the last thing the editors of the Wall Street Journal want on behalf of their overlords, whom they grovel before, is a public discussion about usury, because then the whole thing collapses. Is the Wall Street Journal's board of editors about to argue that Jesus was a communist as well? Do they think this attack against Trump is going to land? It's awfully desperate. And you can see why they're getting desperate, because so many of the parts of their machine, of their system, are falling apart. They are being dismantled. And Trump is calling his shots as he goes. You have to look at this in the big picture and understand that the things happening in real time are happening way ahead of our understanding. We are not caught up. They're talking about these things and others are panicking about these things because they're real, not because Donald Trump is making pie in the sky promises that might happen if the Congress agrees, if Donald Trump is somehow able to scratch out a win in this very real election on November 5th. No, these things are already in motion. They are already inevitable, but cannot be admitted, because then immediately people stop paying. Immediately people begin looking for other options, parallel systems. And it's funny when it comes to cryptocurrency, and most particularly to Bitcoin, they're trying to figure out how not to screw themselves completely and get left out in the rain, while also not putting too much into the idea of Bitcoin, because then their dollar fiat system immediately collapses. The transition is supposed to be into the central bank digital currency. And I find it extraordinarily unlikely that that CBDC is coming in the form of Bitcoin. Trump also said this at an event a few days ago.
I'm curious what you think the future of crypto looks like if, God forbid, you don't win the election.
Future of crypto, what does it look like? Well, I think it's a good future. You know, who knows about anything today? But I think it's a good future. I'll tell you what, you look at values, you look at what's happening and where it's come and where it came from. I think crypto's got a great future. I think it really does.
What if God forbid?
Maybe we'll pay off the $35 trillion in crypto. I'll write out a little piece of paper, 35 trillion crypto. We have no debt. Right? That's what I like, right? He likes that idea too. He's laughing.
What if we pay off the 35 trillion in crypto? I'll just write it on a piece of paper. Here's 35 trillion in crypto. Look at that. No debt. And I know it sounds like he's joking, but is he? The BRICS coalition is expected to bring more countries aboard this year. There's a strong possibility of a cryptocurrency element in that, maybe even Bitcoin. And at some point in the future, there will be a tipping point where the regime fiat currency becomes an afterthought. They don't have the means of enforcing its use around the world anymore. They're losing all their proxy states. The regime is being kicked out. Their currency is being kicked out with it. They'll be down to just the British Commonwealth states. And then by the time the United States leaves, they'll collapse. And so when the global regime's fiat currency is worthless, what is our $35 trillion of debt to the global regime in the form of their fiat currency worth? Zero. Most people listening to this show understand that we are already in an informational World War III, and to some degree, there's a kinetic World War III happening right now as well. Who is that world war against? I would suggest it's against the global regime by these sovereign nations of the world and these nations striving for sovereignty, including our own. Are we going to win a war against the regime and then give them $35 trillion? That's not how wars work, especially not wars against the people who have conducted all former wars and been the cause of so much death and destruction. And let's conclude with a quote from another oligarch, and maybe they can go debunk this one as well. This is from John Paul Getty. If you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. Well, what if you owe the bank $35 trillion and then everybody stops using their money. Whose problem is that? The answer is, who gives a shit? All right, so I'm going to do my best to get an episode up tomorrow. It's not a guarantee, but I plan to. So hopefully I will be back tomorrow. Otherwise, I'll be back Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com. And for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.